alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. This is Dr. Halimah, and this is lecture number 4. As you can see, the title of today's lecture is Interpreting Constellations of Interaction. Now, as you can see, I'm giving you a bit of theoretical background for each lecture I'm giving you. Although it is a practical course, but you need to know something about the theory behind interpreting, so that you would be able to do interpreting more effectively and more efficiently. Now, before we move on, constellations. What does constellations mean? Interpreting constellations of interaction. Constellations means a grouping, and this grouping depends on the interaction. Now, last time, or last lecture number 3, when we talked about interpreting settings, and the settings were based on the environment, the places. So like business interpreting, diplomatic interpreting, or liaison interpreting, or conference interpreting. But today's lecture is about the types of interpreting in terms of interaction. So by the end of this class, or by the end of this lecture, you should be able to demonstrate how bilateral interpreting or dialogue interpreting takes place or is carried out, and how multilateral interpreting is carried out. And then, of course, you need to do a lot of practice mentioned here or outside this class. So we will be explaining what we mean by bilateral interpreting, and what we mean by dialogue interpreting, and what we mean by multilateral interpreting. Okay, these 3 points are the constellations or the groupings of interpreting in terms of interaction, in terms of communication. So number 1, as we say here, you remember last in lecture number 3, we categorized, we grouped interpreting types by what? By the social context and institutional setting. In other words, we classified interpreting according to certain types, like business interpreting, liaison interpreting, community interpreting, conference interpreting, military interpreting, diplomatic interpreting. All these types of interpreting were classified according to what? According to the social context, according to the institutional setting. In other words, types related to the society, to the community, and related to the place where they take place. Of course, business interpreting takes place in organizations, in companies. Military interpreting might take place in the barracks or in prisons, you know. So, but today, the interpreting constellations or interpreting groupings are classified on the basis of interaction, how an interpreter interact with one party or two party or third party, you know. So number 1, bilateral interpreting or dialogue interpreting. Now, bilateral means 2. Bilateral interpreting is based as 3-party interaction. 3-party interaction. 1, 2, 3. The third party is bilingual. It means the interpreter. An interpreter is bilingual. So the interpreter is the focus of this bilateral interpreting. In other words, the interpreter understands 2 languages, and he mediates between, you know, two monolinguals. Like Ali is Arabic speaking person, and John is English-speaking person, and the interpreter is Khalid. Now Khalid speaks Arabic and speaks English. Ali cannot speak Arabic, cannot speak English, or doesn't speak English, and John doesn't speak Arabic. So here we have three-party interaction. Interaction means to communicate between them, you know. Interaction goes like this. So John speaks to Khalid, Khalid interprets to Ali, Ali speaks to Khalid, Khalid interprets to John. This interaction is called bilateral, you know. And what makes it really distinctive is the direction of the interaction, or it is bidirectional. Bidirectional, it means, you know, Ali speaks and, you know, addresses to me so that I interpret, or to Khalid, and then Khalid translate orally into English what Ali said, you know, and John understands the message because it's been interpreted by Khalid, and then he replies to Ali in English, and then Khalid interprets into Arabic. This is the kind of interaction takes place when bilateral interpreting takes place. So this type of interpreting is called bilateral, or even a dialogue. A dialogue is, you know, when two people, you know, talk. It's more or less like, you know, bilateral, a dialogue between the two, and one interprets for the two. And where does this where does this take place as well? It's a liaison. It takes place, or it is associated. It is linked with a liaison interpreting. Liaison interpreting, where the interpreter acts like a liaison officer. He interprets between, you know, this party and that party. So this is one type, one constellation, one grouping, you know, of interpreting based on interaction. Based on interaction, you know. So you need to understand what we mean by interaction. You need to understand what we mean by setting. You need to understand by what we mean by social context, institutional setting. You know why? Because interpreting differs on the basis of all these grouping. But today's, as we said, it is interpreting constellations of interaction. So this is number one, bilateral. I hope it is clear, and you know understood. This is really basic, and this is practiced, you know, everywhere. I mean, if you want to translate simultaneously or interpret simultaneously between two people, then you need to act as a bilateral interpreting. Now the second type of interpreting, or constellation of interpreting, is called multilateral communication interpreting. Multi means more, you know, more than one party involved. In other words, is as this happens in conferences attended by delegates and representatives of various nations and institutions. In other words, when you are an interpreter and you go to a conference hall, or I mean, this mainly happens in the United Nations, where all delegates from all over the world come and meet in that conference hall, and they and they speak. Of course, they speak individually, and everyone has his own language, and so the interpreter here acts like a multilateral communication interpreter. He listens to different people, and he interprets. So he interprets to who? To his own people. Of course, he might be sitting in a booth, in the conference. Now, I'm sure you have heard a lot about conference interpreting. Conference interpreting is used for national or international purposes. It is the most important aspect of interpreting. I'm sure you probably some of you who passed theory of translation, when I taught you theory of translation, I told you something about conference interpreting, when it happened, or when it emerged, when it started, and how. Now, I don't know who among you would be able to remember how interpreting started, but for your information, it started during World War I, and during negotiations between allies, and during that time French was used, and it was the official language for negotiations between fighting parties and so on. Now, when the American and the British negotiators started to really negotiate, in war settlements issues, they couldn't understand French, so they found it difficult to understand French. Then they said, okay, why don't we find an interpreter who could really interpret what's going on in our negotiations. So it started then, and then the United Nations started as, okay, French and English are going to be the principal languages of the United Nations. So from then onwards, conference interpreting has become the most prominent manifestation of interpreting. In other words, the highest level of interpreting, really, constellation is really conference interpreting. Conference interpreting, it pays a lot of money for interpreters. Why? Because it is very official, very important, very serious, and the interpreter goes under a lot of pressure, time, and situation, setting, and so on. That's why if you want to become really a conference interpreter, you need to be really characterized with very, very distinctive qualities, you patient, you bear all the stress and so on. So, but it's worth trying. But of course, you start bit by bit, and then you could really apply. But you could apply to work as a conference interpreter in the United Nations. But people there in the United Nations, or interpreters, they should really know at least 2-3 languages to be able to act as interpreters. It's a good job, but it's really demanding and challenging. But of course, you don't need really to act to use conference interpreting only in the United Nations. No, not really. Conference interpreting could happen, in any organization or in any place where it is official and formal and large and So really, you don't have to wait until until you are accepted at the United Nations to act as a conference. No, not really. But the conference interpreting in the United Nations is the highest rank an interpreter would reach in his career or in her career. Okay. Now, how can we define a conference interpreter? If someone asks, what is a conference interpreter? A conference interpreter, I mean, they agreed on it they agreed on it during a meeting by the European Forum at Alp-Bash, in Austria, 1969, and they said, okay, a conference interpreter is one whose office, it means whose job it is to translate orally the speech of participants in meetings conducted in 2 or more languages. His office may be performed simultaneously. His office means his task, his job may be performed simultaneously or consecutively in the participants' presence. So it is a person whose job is to translate orally the speech of participants in meetings conducted in 2 or more languages. His interpreting could be simultaneous and could be consecutive, where in the presence of participants. So everybody is there and you interpret. You need to have more, it could happen in 2 languages or more than 2 languages. And you need to really interpret the speech orally. So this is the definition of a conference interpreter officially. Okay? Now you can look at conference interpreting and community interpreting as like this. Conference interpreting, focus on the members, the representatives, and community interpreting also focus on members and representatives, and both of them, they work as like an interaction between these members, and the interpreter has to really interpret, and it is like multilateral interpreting or face-to-face interpreting. So it is important to understand the difference between focusing either on the level of the social cultural communities and their members, representatives, or on the format of the interaction. It's up to you really, whether you say, okay, I am focusing on the members or the representatives, or I'm focusing on the type of interaction. So you need to really take all these elements into consideration when you are doing any interpreting. Okay, now a little example for us, or a practice for us to work on. Look at this. Interpret the following into Arabic. Sam. Hello and welcome to the BBC News. I'm Sam. Here is today's main headlines. مرحبا وأهلا بكم إلى أخبار الBBC. أنا سام وهذه عناوين الأخبار اليوم. Sam, we have sent one of our colleagues to Saudi Arabia to investigate probably one of the greatest wonders of the world, to find out who built it, what it looks like, and what people do in it, so that you can go to visit it over to you over to my colleague Bob. Now, while he is saying, you could take notes if you wanted to. If you want to really, if you are translating consecutively, you can take notes. If not, then you act immediately. لقد أرسلنا أحد زملائنا إلى السعودية، المملكة العربية السعودية، للتحقق من ربما واحد من أعظم عجائب الكون، حتى يتأكد لمن بناها وكيف تبدو هذه وماذا يفعل الناس هناك، بحيث يعني يمكنك أن تذهب لتزورها. بوب بوب معكم من هناك. فهنا بوب يقول thank you Sam. This is between, you know, someone in Britain and someone in Mecca, and the one in Britain is talking to his colleague in Mecca, and everybody and people are watching, you know. So this interaction between the news reader and the journalist in Mecca, you know, you need to really interpret in such a way. But this kind of interpreting probably happens on TV, like Al Jazeera, when they interpret people talking from abroad or from outside the country. Thank you Sam. شكرا يا Sam. If you don't know me, إذا لم تعرفوني, I am Bob Hale, and I am here to persuade you to come to the Kaaba.